If you're a mad genius who's created an elaborate eggnet to keep track of your Eggman empire, but have a hard time with hacker furries trying to take over your bases and robot army legions, or you're just a normal person trying to keep their personal information protected online, that's where today's sponsor, Surfshark, is here to help. Think about any of the hundreds of accounts you've set up online. All those terms and services you've just agreed to without ever batting an eye. You've inadvertently have given giant corporations and governments approval to freely look over and sell every little single thing you do online. Yeah, everything. You think those weird, annoying personalized ads are bad? That's just surface level, and that doesn't even begin to cover just how exposed you are to hackers that really want to ruin your day. Surfshark provides you protection from all of that by disguising you online, leaving you free to explore that vast ocean of the internet, safe from everything out there wanting to exploit you or do you harm, covering an unlimited amount of devices from phones, smart TVs, consoles, computers, Wi-Fi routers, tablets, and hey, there are some fun perks. Most notably, it lets you access libraries of your streaming services in other countries. You'd be surprised how wildly different Netflix can be from country to country, which is doubly nice since streaming services are getting a little out of hand. So yeah, Surfshark can grant you access to a plethora of content without killing your bank account. But it gets even better, because if you use the offer code Apologist, or just head to the link you see on screen or in the video description, you get 83% off your purchase and an extra 3 months. Thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring the video, and let's get on with it. Welcome to What's in a Name. We've done a few videos for this series already, and while I would love to talk about some other wacky examples of localization in gaming, I still have a couple more Sonic related ones, and without a doubt the most famous example of a name change revolves around this guy, the villainous Mad Doctor who traps animals and robots and builds giant Star Wars ripoffs. I am of course speaking of the one and only Dr. Robot Egg Jim Carrey. Alright, so the one and only bit there is not exactly true, and the name of this guy can be a little confusing depending on when you grew up and what part of the world you grew up in. And depending on those factors, you'll know the good doctor by one of two names. Dr. Eggman in Japan, and now everywhere in the States, or Dr. Robotnik. If you're an ancient creature like myself, but yet somehow managed to find healthier interests in life outside of a blue hedgehog, you might be wondering why this guy, that you've always known as Robotnik, is called by your idiot child Eggman. That's because that's the name they decided to go with over in Japan. But as we've explained with that whole Mobius situation, since they decided to make up lore in every region of the world when building up their new star mascot, yeah, the western side of things decided the name was a little too silly. So, out with the Eggman, and in with Robotnik. How'd they come up with the name? Well, they probably just chopped off the first part of Sonic's name and then added the word robot in its place, since, you know, the whole guy's shtick was robots. So you have Sonic and Robotnik. It's an ingenious naming scheme if you ask me. That is one potential answer, and it might even be part of the answer, but Robotnik is an actual word. I wasn't aware of that until I was doing research for this video, but yeah, Robotnik is indeed a Slavic word that means worker, or slave depending on which Slavic language you're using. And it's where the word robot actually originated from, as it means, essentially, a mechanical slave or worker. There's a great Reddit post by Real Modmaker that summarizes all of this in a much more succinct and detailed way, so I'd recommend go checking that out if you want any more details there. But yeah, that's pretty cool and fairly creative, honestly. But with all of that sorted out in terms of the western side of things, where on earth did the name Eggman come from? Well, design alone, you can see why he would be called Eggman, but I would imagine that the name probably comes from the same place everything in early Sonic came from: pop culture references. And yeah, I know official sources will say one thing or another, but I would not be remotely surprised if the name was first grabbed from the Beatles, as it is a line from the ridiculous song I Am the Walrus. What's it mean? Probably nothing. The entire song is pure drug-induced madness, and it's fantastic. And also super, super famous. So no, I don't believe for a second that Yuji Naka or the rest of the Sonic team had not heard one of the most famous songs during the time where they were growing up. Who knows, maybe they even got the idea for the mustache with the I Am the Walrus part of the song. And that lyric, I am the Eggman would be the title for Eggman's SA2 theme, but more on that a little bit later. But even stranger than the name is his design itself, as it might actually predate Sonic in terms of conceptualization. When I was a kid, I just assumed that the rotund body, emphasis on red in his uniform, and prominent mustache was a slight jab at Mario. After all, Sonic was created specifically to take down the plumber. But apparently, Eggy is inspired by Teddy Roosevelt, and before Sonic was in the running to be Sega's mascot. I mean, hey, this all worked for Mario. Why not this guy? Stashes were in, baby. Then again, as much as early Sonic took from Castle in the Sky, among plenty of other bits of pop culture, as someone on Twitter pointed out, yeah, Eggman might have taken a few inspirations leading to his final design outside of an old president. But obviously, they went with the hedgehog over the bald man in terms of the starring mascot, but they loved this design so much that he was recast as the main villain, and has since become as iconic as Sonic himself. And hey, in terms of this specific version of the character, I will give Sega this much. In the early days, he stayed pretty consistent. He has plenty of egg-themed bots to send after those dreaded furries he hates so much, all while building so many cities and carnivals. There's not much else to him. Dude's real smart and he wants to rule the world with the help of his technology, leading to a lot more obvious nature versus machine themes in the early days, which would be used to inspire different canons in the West. A mad doctor that builds a bunch of robots and captures animals. There's not much else you need to that. But then you gave him over to the western side of Sega. Outside of Japan, this dude got some of the wildest redesigns and flat out reinventions depending on the canon you're looking at. There are two obvious redesigns we need to look at, but make no mistake, these are not the only other versions of this one character. I'm of course referring to the Dr. Robotniks of the two Sonic cartoons of the day. There are other offshoots from these very designs, but we gotta start somewhere, so let's start with Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. Jaleel White's Sonic the Hedgehog didn't change a whole lot personality-wise between either show, and I'd actually argue that the tone of each is dictated by their versions of the villain, as this version of Robotnik is a frustrated troll of a man stuck in a cartoon world, voiced brilliantly by the late great Long John Baldry.
My full name is Dr. Ivo Robotnik. Not that anyone's ever asked.
This Robotnik was largely overlooked by his SatAM counterpart, but thanks to the internet, the sheer insanity of his performance now lives forever in meme form. I've always seen this version as the ugliest of all the designs, and as such, it was my least favorite as a kid. But looking back on it now, he's an absolute treat. And honestly, there's a lot more modern Eggman in this version of the character than I initially realized. He's got two dimwit sidekicks he's always yelling at, but always keeps around for some reason, constantly praising his own genius while making cartoonishly ridiculous contraptions, and hey, they try to stay true to the games, sort of. He has his Eggmobile on occasion, he has plenty of egg-themed puns, and even is referred to as
Guess again, Eggman.
just the one time, but that beats out Adventures by quite a few years. So I guess Adventures beat out Adventure. There were always obvious nods to his original name and the egg themes, even here in the West. Little noticeable background details or the obviously named Death Egg among plenty of other robots. But on that note, the Western named Badniks have stuck around, and personally I'm thankful for it. I love that name. And on the flip side, you had obvious nods to the name Robotnik, at least in terms of Robotnik Winter in Triple Trouble, which yes, that was the name of the level even in Japan. So yeah, this version of Robotnik stayed a little more true to the original Eggman than I had ever realized. But still, I've never understood why the West was so keen to make this design the established game version of the character in merchandise or in this cartoon. This was his design for the Sonic 3 McDonald's tie-in here in the West. They swapped out classic Eggy for the Game Gear version of Spinball's cover. He is the version of Robotnik in Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. They even made a big stink about changing the original Eggman design over to this goofy troll in the Fleetway comic. That is technically a separate character since that's a separate canon, so we might as well get into it now and hang on tight because this is a wild series of events and it's not even the craziest one we're covering today. See, in the Fleetway series, Robotnik started off looking like the original game version, at least to a degree. This was still that weird eyeless version you'd see on the covers of the American releases of Sonic 2 and 3. But Robotnik didn't even start off looking like this. As it turns out, Robotnik was originally a good-natured scientist named Dr. Dr. Kintobar. Yeah, it's Robotnik backwards, and it's not the last time you'll see that name thrown around in comic books. Kintobar only became Robotnik after a lab accident in which he was bathed in evil chaos energy alongside a rotten egg. Yeah, dude is literally part egg, and they still called him Robotnik. But like I already stated, this design would not last too long, as he would later transform into that ugly troll form by encasing himself and then literally hatching out of an egg, still called Robotnik. As wacky as all this sounds, the Fleetway series is actually a lot of fun, and this version of the character, while chock full of egg puns, is actually fairly intimidating, especially compared to the Adventures of version. He's large, gross, and somewhat terrifying, and when the adventure games came into play, he swapped out his little elf shoes for the modern Eggman design, and I gotta admit, it looks awesome. Apparently, the writer of the book pitched the idea of redesigning him yet again once the adventure games came into play, but that idea was shot down, and I'm kind of thankful for it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to look at this particular design, and again, I love it. But yes, this dude has basically gone through 3 designs, and yet somehow that record was beaten. But all of that in due time. We first need to talk about the other prominent Western Robotnik design. That one being, of course, the SatAM version of the character voiced by the legendary Jim Cummings. Yes, that's Winnie the Pooh, among like a million other characters. The guy's incredible. And hey, fun little note here, Jim Cummings actually plays an evil doctor in OKKO, who did a crossover episode with Sonic the Hedgehog, in which that character played into a lot of Dr. Robotnik references. So for a little while, it was like Jim Cummings was also playing the Adventures of version of the character, which is just adorable. Fun little factoid. Just wanted to throw it in there. Anyway, back to this guy. It's still beyond me why they went so far as to not only redesign the original game version of the character, but make 2 entirely different designs and personas at the same time. This version of Robotnik is less of a doctor and more of just a flat-out tyrant. While there's no death egg, there is still plenty of Star Wars at play here, giving the Doctor a chunky Darth Vader vibe alongside Stormtrooper-like SWAT bots. This dude is not a goofball like his counterparts. He is cruel and gets off to it. There's a mixture of fury and pleasure dripping with every word coming out of his mouth. He lives in a world of furries. If there's a kink you could post on DeviantArt, this boy is probably into it. Also, unlike a lot of other eggs in this batch of baddies, this dude actually won. He has taken over Mobotropolis. He is an overwhelming threat to this world that Sonic can't just take down in a couple of spin dashes. Robotnik was originally Warlord Julian in the kingdom of Mobotropolis, right up until he betrayed King Acorn and overran the city with pollution and turned the citizens into robotic slaves with his roboticizer. Well, I say his roboticizer, but it was actually invented by Sonic's Uncle Chuck, which personally I never liked that much. I think robotization is a really scary and cool concept, but I don't like that Robotnik himself didn't invent it. Feels like it takes away from his genius and the whole doctor thing. And honestly, thinking about it now, I kind of like how much of Eggman's personal touch is in his wacky-ass robot designs in the games. The drab uniform designs of SatAM kind of take away a lot of that charm. But all that said, it really helped with the tone of the show and the tone of this version of the character. He does stand out from the pack. He felt like a truly dangerous presence every time he was on screen. And while the lore veers far from the games, there are so many elements kicked off in SatAM that I genuinely miss and would love to see returned to the franchise. Turning allies into robots and turning against the rest of the cast was always a terrifying idea. Robotropolis is such an overwhelming presence. I really wish the games would establish a home city base that was a little more permanent like this place was. And again, I never really liked the robot designs of the show. I will talk about that stupid cheetah another time. But I gotta admit, I love the SWAT bots. They are still iconic and I would love to see them again. We of course also have his lackey Snively, but this video isn't about him. Point is, this version of Robotnik brings a lot to the table. And while the original showrunner and writer has unfortunately passed away, they did at least end his story in a real cool way. But who knows, the fan-created Season 3 might bring more to that story. That certainly didn't stop Fleetway and Archie fans. That said, SatAM Robotnik would serve as the basis for the Archie version of Robotnik. And if you are not familiar with the history of this version of the character, you might need to sit down for this. I'm gonna do my best to do this entire series events from memory. I'm not looking any of this up, so let me know if I get anything wrong. But first thing I want you to do is take a look at the cover of issue 0 of Sonic. You'll notice that Robotnik looks a lot like the original game design. You see that? Cool, because it's it's going to take them at least 25 years to come back to this design. Because the moment you take a peek inside the book, you'll see that he actually sports the Sad I Am design, but carries the personality that's more in line with Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog's Robotnik. This is a separate continuity from both of those shows, but if the early tone is close to anything, it's closer to Adventures. But within a year or two, it would lean far more into the Sad AM version of things. The first rendition of this Robotnik uses the classic game badniks as his lackeys to abuse, as well as the occasional SWAT bot. We'll talk a little bit more about all of that in Archie Sonic speed reading, but I'll tell you right now, I think these are by far my favorite Robotnik lackeys. I love these guys. Anyway, as the comic carried on, as I said, it would drop this particular tone and fall more in line with the lore being set up in Season 2 of Sad AM. And while it is a technically different series of events, Archie does kind of act as a continuation of the Sad AM lore. At least they would right up until issue 50. Robotnik died in his own way in Sad AM, and he would die in a different way here in Archie, as the team was under the assumption that the book was coming to a close. And as such, Ken Penders would write a story where Sonic and Robotnik would have one final battle, with the good doctor ending up dead. But as you probably know, the comic continued, going from issue 50 all the way up to issue 290, and that's not including all of the spin-off books. But while the comic kept going, Robotnik did not. That's right, this character died in the first quarter of this series' existence and stayed dead, technically. There was an issue where he returned and met the modern Eggman, who is technically a separate character, and that would be a really cool idea. I would love to see Jim Cummings and Mike Pollock in the same room playing these versions of the character, but this comic itself was awful. Just a waste of a great idea. Anyway, back on track. Yeah, after issue 50, Sonic and pals would go on to different adventures with different enemies, and they could get away with this for a while. This was during the Saturn era of Sonic content, so not a whole lot of stuff was coming out. But when Sonic Adventure came around and realigned everything, the comics had to come more in line with the new game canon. And while Fleetway was doing its own insane thing, Archie said, "Hold my beer." So to get around the lack of a Robotnik, they brought back an alternate universe version of the character that was introduced all the way back in the early days of Pender's writing. That would be Robotnik. Originally, he had conquered the Mobius of his universe and then roboticized himself, or maybe he was always a robot. Anyway, he comes back to the Prime version of Mobius, but actually he might be a different version of Robotnik, as his backstory doesn't quite line up. I don't know if they ever actually said he was a different version. I have to go back and check. So this could not only be just a separate version of Robotnik, but a separate version of Robotnik. Are you keeping up? Because I'm not done. Sonic and the Freedom Fighters defeat this new Robotnik 2.0, but since he is a robot, he backs up his digital presence into a new body, that of the then newly designed Adventure Era Dr. Eggman. And since this is the start of the Adventure Era, yes, Sonic and his pals start calling him Eggman. But since this is Archie getting away with whatever they wanted to get away with, they interchanged that name with Robotnik a whole lot for years to come. Well, I might have buried the lead, but yes, the first time the modern version of Eggman showed up in Archie, he was introduced as a robot. A robot that can turn any organic thing he touches into robots. Yeah, he has a robotization touch. It's an interesting idea, I guess, but we need to hang on. We're not even halfway done with this. When they grew tired of this robot shtick, they brought in aliens that turned Sonic and Tails into robots to fight Eggman and Snively as humans, because Snively was turned into a robot for a little while. It was this weird tournament thing, but the whole point of it was to basically turn everybody into organic beings and get all this bot nonsense off the table. Then later on, after Ian Flynn took over the book, Robotnik goes crazy for a bit, but when he snaps out of it, he decides to soft reboot the world, which shakes up the canon and changes the old Robotnik design into the classic game Eggman with the Sonic Genesis miniseries. But then they pop back right into the canon they had just left, so I don't know how much of that is actually part of the canon after this point. But then they pull that nonsense again with the Super Genesis wave, and this time it sticks, changing the old lore of Julian and changing him over to Eggman, who's always just been called Eggman, and technically always a part of this new canon, so all of that crap with the death and alternate dimension robot stuff is just out the window. But yeah, like I said, took them a really long ass time just to get back to that original Eggman look. Archie Eggman was kinda every other version of Robotnik and Eggman rolled into one character, changing drastically. But yeah, as insane as this sounds, if if you're familiar with superhero comic history, this is fairly standard. They pull this crap all the time. Go read about like any Spider-Man character if you want a nice trippy headache. The history itself looks insane when explained out, but the overall point is to develop some sort of new status quo or return a character to their default classic iconic design. Archie Eggman had a wild ride, but really, even with the drastic retcons, Dr. Eggman still talks and acts the same way Flynn has always written him. A super casual fan could pick up one of Ian Flynn's late Archie books, then pick up a random IDW book by the guy, and while you will notice some different stories and obviously some different casts, Dr. Eggman sounds like Dr. Eggman, even though those are technically two very different versions of the character. I still see people in the comments of these videos and in a lot of Sonic speedreading videos that think these are the same guys in the same canon universe, and that was intentional. Flynn was tasked to help bring Archie more in line with the games, and in turn, a lot more consistency and characterization for these iconic characters, which is why Sonic Boom makes absolutely no sense. While I could never see myself calling the Saturday Robotnik Eggman, the exact opposite is true for the Boom version of this same character, even though, ironically, he's the most fit of any version of Eggman. Well, okay, Super Robotnik might give him a run for his money. And actually, that version of the character also sported an Ace Bomber look before Boom. So, man, I don't know what to say. Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog's Robotnik was a trendsetter. And Boom Eggman has the most consistent English voice actor of the character, Mike Pollock, who was already iconic by the time this show and video games came out. But this one is sillier than even the Adventures version of the character. He is still technically a threat, but he's a major source of comic relief in a show full of comic relief, and it's never actually that big of a problem. I think Sonic and pals just see him as some means to break up the boredom in their lazy beachside village. We'll talk more about this offshoot of the franchise. I'm not the biggest fan of the designs, but I really love this version of Eggman, and I got a lot of love for the jokes of this show. But yeah, wow, that's a lot of eggs. And that's still not including that weird French comic, the manga, Sonic Underground, which is technically a different version of the SatAM version of Robotnik. And of course, the Jim Carrey take on the character, which is just Jim Carrey, and whatever the upcoming one in Sonic Prime will end up being. You might be wondering, why did I talk about all these versions of this one character if the point was to sort out which name is better between Eggman and Robotnik? Well, I'll get to my point, but they actually solved this problem a long time ago. In a rare bit of brilliance from Sonic Team, as many of you Sonic fans already know, they came up with what is possibly the single best compromise we could have ever asked for.
Talking egg.
Silence! I am Dr. Robotnik, the greatest scientific genius in the world!
Whatever you say, Eggman.
The western side of the world finally had the name Eggman become commonplace in the franchise, and not even stopping there, in the sequel, Sonic Adventure 2, they would do the same for the Japanese audience with the name Robotnik, as we finally get some history of the character and see some of his family in Gerald and Maria Robotnik, all while fully embracing the name Eggman, as we can see with his theme song, but still being proud of the Robotnik name as it's violently swirling along with a whole bunch of other nonsense while he's threatening the world. The two adventure games cemented and canonized both names in a rare but beautiful union between Sega of America and Japan. But it does need to be said, going forward from here, and still technically to the present day, it does feel like this was Sega trying to firmly cement Eggman as the one true name of the character and bury the name Robotnik as it was rarely seen in the years following. But even with it being buried, as so many other Western ideas were when it comes to Sonic, the name Robotnik still persisted, partially thanks to Archie, and largely in older generations fondly remembering their time with their Sega Genesis, occasionally wondering why the hell they changed the name into something so silly. But even though they made the swap all the way back in 1999, all these years later, that name is just too iconic to ever truly erase it from Sonic history. And unlike the constant fight for relevance for the name Mobius or the inclusion of Freedom Fighters, Sega actually did the decent thing and once again doubled down on acknowledging both names in their recent Tales Tube series, which exists to help streamline the current game canon. Here, they said the Doctor's true name is Dr. Ivo Robotnik, but has since embraced what was once an insult of a name, and now calls himself Dr. Eggman. Look at this bad bitch. He's letting it all flow out. This man puts his face on everything. Sonic may be fast and bust robots, but Eggman's body positivity is his true superpower. And of course, the movies themselves once again took on the name Robotnik. The name Eggman is thrown around here and there, of course, but as an old fan, I cannot tell you how great it is to hear that name again, and on the big screen no less. And I can walk into a Target in the year 2022 and pick up an action figure that proudly displays the name Robotnik on it. And in that same store, I can go and grab a different figure with the name Eggman. How great is that? The reason I went to so much trouble to talk about all the different versions of this one character is to show that these two names have always been a part of the franchise, and you can see bits of every version of this one character in every other version of this character. There have always been references to both names, and I feel like this character is a shining example of how to compromise and roll in different aspects of this franchise into one beautiful canon. Earth or Mobius, Hydro City or Hydrocity, Freedom Fighters or Gamecast or Fleetway Cast, Mecha Sonic or Silver Sonic, my man Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik is here to respond to all of those choices with, why not both? Yeah, I always have my preferences and my biases, we all do. But the point is less about trying to say one is better than the other and more that every option has merit, and with just a little creativity, we can have our eggs and eat them too. And with all that said, I'm kind of hungry. I think I'm going to make myself an omelet. But that's going to do it for another episode of What's in a Name. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and it feels so good to finally talk about the most iconic Sonic villain on this channel. I just realized this is the very first video I've ever dedicated to him, and it feels good to actually talk again. I don't feel like death anymore. I finally have conquered COVID, so thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and waiting for me to get my act together, and thank you to my dear friend Channel Pup, who has been helping me stay afloat because I've not been able to do much of anything for the last little while. The man is amazing. He just split up his channel into 3 different segments, so you can get a nice healthy variety of content in all 3 categories. So go check out his stuff, and be sure you check us out on Sunset City, our weekly Sonic podcast. We've covered a lot of Sonic, obviously, but we have just a great time in general. We do a lot of streaming, we do a lot of goofing off, so once again, check that out. Links are in the description. Would really love to see that show grow, so give it all the support you can, please. And hey, if you want to help support this channel, I do of course have a Patreon. Those folks get shows early. They get the audio of the show even earlier than that. Get access to our Discord server, which I will hopefully be in a little bit more often now that my health has returned. So if you want to come hang out with us there, all you gotta do is pitch in $1. 2 gives you a vote, which I've not been doing a whole lot of, so we might reorganize that particular tier. And $5 gets a name shout out. And there's quite a few people that want their name shouted out by my weird voice, so let me go ahead and thank them all individually right now. So massive thank you to Kyle Winter, Cirrus the Skeptic, Joseph Duncan Sonic 2 Blue, John, Josh Strider, Casey Egg Monroe, Xanderoni the Painter, Hatsworth, Ginger Bob, Jack of All Spades, Tristan Trapp, Meekers, Dun Dun, Quote, Resident Fanboy, Miles the Prower, Jeremy Singer, Mr. Boojay, Rain, Sam Webster, Dwight Graham, Fish Flop, Lucas Lipker, The Bad Pal, Jonathan Dobbs, Just Really Likes Princess Sally, shout out to my fellow Simp Monk, Cloverhood, Shoden, Mr. SP, Cecil the Glade, The Dark Neon, Stefan Platonica, Bree Monic, Ty Cyan, Graham J. Hall, Lenny X, Wayne is Boss, Jamie Chevalier, Lederick, David 20, The Lumberjack, Wiki, Gimme That Funky Beat, yo, my name is Mick Nick, and on the web, I'm the Gist TM, but you can call me Icky Nicky because my rhymes are sick. And he left a dash there. Oh God, there's going to be more. And I was literally sick, so good on you there, Otis. NBTV, Mute, Trash Baphomet, Autumn from Twitter.com, That T. Elos, Main, Muy Saxy, Jin Seotame, Nezin, Interjack 5, Grayson Coniger, Spades the Nocturne, Ken K, Then 101, Paxton Bisbee, Sundarin 7, Stevie Cole, Twilord, Asir Warns of a Deadly Fate, Paisley, Eric Delgado, Cody Gracius, Kodinsky, Jamo Art, PK Durbar, Give Up Your Children, Separate, Sonic PAJ, Zagard Lagan, and And if any haters say I'm not funky on YouTube, let them know I got sponsored saying toot toot, wiggity wiggity, word up, Mr. Boucher. Beautiful, Otis. Bravo. Roxas the Cat and Blake Smith. I wonder if we do need to reconfigure the naming thing here, because there's a lot of names to read off now, which is a good chunk of the end of the video. So hey, patrons, if you want me to switch that up to something else, just let me know. Otherwise, if you want me to keep doing these insane readings, I'm more than happy to. I am honored to see all these names on here supporting this very stupid thing I do for a living. Thank you so much again for all the support. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time. Toot toot, Egg Warriors.